So this is Last Recovery YouTube, and I want to talk a little bit about I said this is a journey in faith and recovery, and I want to talk a little bit about my journey and that interesting thing, some of the things you run into when you're trying to navigate that whole faith thing and the recovery thing. So I'm not sure how it's going to work out. I'll probably do a lot of editing on this, but this is my thoughts on that journey from my own experience. I got sober in 1974. Coming up pretty soon. This is coming up November, so I'll be 45 years sober in November, middle November. So obviously I was young and now I'm older, but I want to talk a little bit about that journey, that recovery journey and that faith journey and how they've intersected. I got sober in 74. I'm a pastor's son, but I never really gone to church much. When I graduated, went to college, I just didn't go to church in college. I just really didn't go to church. And I went into the Navy, and I appreciated the boot camp services. They had church and boot camp, and I really sort of appreciated those. They made me calm and stuff in a difficult situation. But did I go to church afterwards? No, I didn't go to a church afterwards. I just didn't. I didn't go to church when I was in college. And really, I didn't go to church much when I was home. I just wasn't a churched guy. I mean, I obviously went to my dad's church and did that, and I was active in youth groups and all that stuff. I was active in Boy Scouts and the churches where my dad was a pastor. But I wasn't, and I've been to camp, youth group camps and stuff. Very, very, very familiar with the church where at CR where I go. They did devos. They didn't have a name for that. They did devos, and they had you prayed and you generally and everything like that. And it never stuck with me. In the Navy, I drank, and drank to the point of needing to go to rehab, and and drank to the point of getting sober on Antabuse and then relapsing. And I finally headed home after I got out of the Navy, and I was a little desperate because I'd relapsed, and it wasn't the last drunk wasn't good. Wasn't good at all. I was doing things that I was concerned about. I wasn't much of a carouser, but that last time I was doing things I'd never done with people I didn't know, and I was a little concerned that I wasn't going to be too picky about who I did what with in order to get a drink, because I was running out of money. And I came home. I just went home. And I'd been to AA. I'd been to rehab. I'd been to AA. I'd gone to meetings and during my enforced sobriety on Antabuse. I knew the AA. And I just started going. And I got a sponsor, and spiritually he was the bottom of the barrel. He was a sort of charismatic guy, not sober, maybe a couple of years, maybe. It turns out he was a womanizer, and he used tarot cards to seduce the women. I didn't know nothing about nothing, so that didn't mean anything to me. But it creeped me out a little bit, and I just really wasn't into this guy. It was just like, no, and I basically pulled away from him. I made some other friends, in the same group, and it turns out that guy sort of drizzled away. He went away, and these other people that I got to know basically stayed around. We formed sort of a clique. We were, it took a year or so, but we sort of went to conferences together, and we got to know each other, and we talked on the phone. There were four of us that were pretty tight. It fluctuated around, but I still know one guy he was a little younger than me. He's about 6 years younger. He was really young then. He was like 21. I was 28, something like that. But we talk on the phone, and I go to visit him once or twice a year. Him and his wife, and they're good friends. They're good. That's a good, lasting relationship. Another good friend of mine that I talk to every week, he passed away. He was older. He was 41 when I was 28. He passed away at 72. I miss him a lot. And that was, I got sober. I stayed sober. I went to conferences. I did a bunch of stuff. I was AA spiritual. I found that I functioned well on the spiritual level of things. I like to talk about God at conferences. I like to talk. I was reading the Bible in early years. I would sit, in my studio apartment just off the combat zone in Boston, and read the Bible and eat fruit. I got into a fruit binge that I still have. Every night I'll eat veggies and fruit and stuff. Is it good to sleep? Probably not, but it's that's what I did. And it came to be a thing for me. But the Bible thing was just there. I read it, and it was there, and I did the Bible thing, and I went to meetings, and I go to conferences, and I talk all this heavy duty spiritual stuff, and I was 2 years sober, and I ran into a girl, as luck as would have it. She was sort of ditzy, nice but ditzy, and spiritual, and a little crazy, a little messed up. It turns out that that's my weakness. If I had a food weakness, it's not a food weakness, it's a female. It's ditzy females, heavily spiritual, and pretty much crazy. Couldn't get enough. But I chased her into a prayer meeting, and it was the charismatic renewal, and I loved it. It played to my gifts. I'm a pastor's kid. It prayed I could talk reasonably. I'm not the prettiest guy, but I could talk reasonably well, and I wasn't too afraid of public speaking and stuff like that. So, it was beautiful. I was doing well, and Ruthie was there and everything, and I was doing great. And they had a thing called Life in the Spirit Seminar, and I did that. And somewhere in that process, I got saved. She's praying. Ruthie was praying for me, and I got saved. And it was a profound experience. A week of just turmoil, and then finally I understood. Somehow I got it. Saved by grace through faith. He died for me, and I can be safe and saved by him if I just believe in him. And I got it. I just got it. And it was pretty amazing. Jesus of Nazareth came out at that time, and it was amazing. And I started to get a little less intrigued with the Catholic Church. I tried a Baptist church. That wasn't getting it done. I was charismatic. And I talked to some people on the phone, and they suggested this church in Wayland. And I went. At that point, Wellesley Park was bursting at the seams. They were going to build a new church and everything like that. And I went, and I just kept going back. I kept going back, it was awkward for me, but I kept going back. I liked the worship. I liked it. Things were moving. You know, I was moved by the Spirit, and I was being used in the Spirit, and it was amazing. It was just absolutely amazing. I wasn't. I was still sort of going to AA. I was still, I was still in my AA groove and stuff like that. But more and more and more of my time was taken up with church. I got more and more. I was involved in church. It was I got involved with a theater group that a guy, theater type group in the church. It was a little weird, but I got involved with that, and in the process of that, met my ex-wife. Spiritually, I had no clue. I didn't know what I was doing, and I got involved, and I was impressed with her, the spiritual impact. Well, it turns out the spiritual impact was spiritual, but not necessarily the right type. But first time in my life, there were women in various degrees in my life. I was dating an older woman. I was dating another lady I met in Brighton, and then there was my future wife, and and there was others. It was like that was a period of time I was. Oh, what was I? I was probably 30. And I was Christian. And I was a male, and that was a very valuable commodity. So there was interest, and I was growing and changing, and I started my own business, and I'd done a bunch of stuff that was sort of cool, and somewhere along the line I stopped because the church consumed everything, and it was at that point it was exciting. The Spirit was moving. The church we were going to was, by everybody's estimate, just one of the best churches around. The pastor was a good preacher. The Spirit was moving in such a marvelous way. Things were happening. I mean, good things, good spiritual things were happening. And it was amazing. It was during that period, it was amazing. And I was getting into good relationships, and I got into bad relationships, but AA sort of couldn't compete with the church, and I sort of wandered away. I got married, and for one reason or another, my ex really didn't want the competition of AA because I had friends, and I talked to them all the time, and she just couldn't deal with that. So gradually she weaned me off that, and she tried to wean me off my family and stuff like that, and the family thing didn't work. I was tight with my family, and I felt good seeing them once a week or something like that. So I'd always see them once a week, and stuff. My ex didn't like that at all, but I did it anyway. It wasn't as often, but I did see them. I'd sneak off sometimes and see them. And AA withered because, my ex-wife just really didn't want the AA people around, so she campaigned against it. And so I did church people and everything like that. I was very active in the church, and doing a bunch of stuff, and being with my ex-wife, being a husband was a full-time job. And then eventually I ended up I was independent, but then I got a job. And with the job came financial security, and then that was kids. And there was 2 kids over the course of a couple of years. But, that was I was in the church. I was in that church. I was there 3 or 4 times a week. And then when I became a single parent, I was there as often as I could be there when they had child care, because it was the only child care I could get. And I was there all the time. They grew up in church. They grew up in the assemblies. They grew up knowing the Bible because the children's church was very good there. And I worked in some of that, and I was active every place. And dramas came and stuff like that, and I participated in those, and lighting, and eventually, and had parts in it and stuff like that. And that was the way I conducted my thing. My Christian life was in the church. And I very seldom after that talked to my friends in AA. They drifted out of things, and and obviously the pressure was not to make connection with them or my family. I just basically refused and stayed in connection with my family as best I could. But AA I let go because there was too much hassle. And that was fine. I was married for 6 years, 2 kids came. We're talking, 4 or 5 years down the road, and things were going to garbage. It was obvious to everybody but me that a change needed to be made, and it was an unpopular change. If I'd been in AA, it would have been a little easier, because one thing AA people are, they're practical. And you didn't have to talk long about the situation, and they would have done it. They would have told me what they thought. Church people weren't like that, and that's something you have to understand when you're doing stuff. When you're in this intersection between faith and recovery. Generally, my experience is that, in most cases, unless you're doing theological stuff, and moral stuff, recovery people are practical. They're going to tell you what practically looks like. They're going to tell you the truth. Church people, they're going to tell you Bible truth, whether it's applicable or not, whether they know anything about it or not. They're going to tell you stuff just so they feel good about telling you Bible, without any practicality about the result. So, the situation gets more and more dire, and any advice I got from church people was usually, not really a good direction to go. And in church, they're not they're only going to give you biblical advice, which is perfectly, absolutely wonderful. Except they don't deal with real life situations. They will soldier on and not really understand what's going on. And that's what you've got to sort of, when you're dealing in 2 areas, in other words, you're dealing in the secular recovery area and a church area, you've got to understand the strengths and the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of both places. So, my advice is, just understand. Understand, where you're going to get good advice and when you're not. And it's difficult to jump from one to another. But I've sort of found that there's a value in both, because both have their strengths and their weaknesses. And it's very hard to parse that together, because both sides think they have all the strengths and none of the weaknesses, which is pretty much the way it is with organizations. They're heavily invested in saying they've got all the answers. And it's just human nature, it's group nature, it's everything nature. So what I'd say is just, understand the weaknesses and the strengths, because I think your recovery is strengthened by having a truly faith group as part of your recovery thing. In other words, we'll talk a little bit about the varying flavors of it and stuff like that, strengths and weaknesses. But I think that your recovery is strengthened if you have a good, solid faith component Obviously I got saved and I'm a Christian thing, and I think that is the best. But I'm very keenly aware of the weaknesses of it, the aberrations that can come, because human organizations tend to aberrate. They tend to like wander off, or they don't tend to stay in the sweet spot of their organization. They tend to wander off. And we'll talk a little bit about that. You can get into some pretty sick churches, and you can get into some pretty ridiculous recovery groups. Everybody knows that, not every group is the same. You can get into a group that's, very religious in their AA, NA stuff. There might be, it's almost cultish in their big book stuff. You got to do it the way the big book, because it's the holy grail. And I get people really teed off at me, if I say, you're getting really religious about this stuff, and they get really upset. But they are. They're very pharisaical about their particular interpretation of the big book, or whatever the NA book is. It's like, this is the text, this is the holy book. This is and it's very human, and it's very much people addicted personality, very prone to that. So you got to understand what you're getting into. But anyway, that was, I got into it, and then I went back to my AA friends, and talked to my AA friend in particular, rather continuously during the period of time I was separating and getting divorced, and I stayed in contact with him. We basically had a thing, that I called him every Sunday night, and about the same time, a habit type of guy. Call him, 9:30, 10 o'clock or something like that, and he was expecting the call, and we'd chat and catch up and do stuff, and it was pretty much a weekly thing. And then every once in a while, we'd set up a time, and I'd go pick him up, and we'd go to a movie or something like that. It was a bit of a trip for me. I was in the suburbs, and he was in Boston, so I'd have to drive 40 minutes, pick him up, and we'd go to a movie, and then we'd have to, he was peculiar. He didn't have a car, so he'd con me into going to a 24-hour store, and I'd sit there for a half hour while I bought the place out. And I was pissed off, because I had kids. I had to get back. I had sitters. I had kids. You couldn't be away, it was, the meter was on, and he didn't have a car, so he wanted to use me, but that's who he was. He was a dear friend, but he was really frustrating too. But I had that through most of my years. I can remember the day, and it was I don't know, it was probably, he was 72 when he passed away, and so I was 14 years younger than him. So I was in his late 50s, maybe. And I called on a Sunday night, my regular Sunday night, and I didn't get him, and I called back, and finally I reached his daughter Faith, and she said, "Yeah, I'm afraid he passed away." And I went, "Whoa!" And so I went to the funeral, and it was weird, because the Four Musketeers, we were a crew, very diverse people, but we were a crew, and one of us had died, so we all got together at the funeral and stuff, and it was a little weird, but I was the odd man out, because I was the religious one. They were all pretty much still AA type troops, but I was out. I was sort of I was accepted, but they knew, I was the whack job. I was the Jesus is Wonderful bumper sticker type of guy. But I never dissed them or anything like that. AA, I have a fondness for AA to this day. but I've been pretty thoroughly in the church since. So I know the church thing. And I'm still sober. I go to meetings, what do I go, one a year maybe or something like that. But I'm in church pretty much, 2 or 3 times a week. So, and active. The churches come and go, but I'm active, and not as active as I need to be, but, I'm staff at a CR and stuff like that. So that's once a week, and I'm teaching and stuff like that. And I do think that, you need a faith community, a reasonably conservative faith community to, sort of put strength to this stuff, because, I've been to AA again, and there's an awful lot of stuff there, and I'm not altogether comfortable that it's reliable. But, I want to, that's why I'm talking about this. I don't know how much I'll use, but, there's strengths and their weaknesses, and it's educational to both groups to hear what the strengths and weaknesses are. If you go to Revelation, the prophet talks about in the Spirit talks about the strengths and the weaknesses. Jesus, basically does a commentary on some of churches, and it's like, I like this, but this I don't like, and it varies between, I like this, I think it's great, I'm with you, but I have problems with this area, and then others are like, okay, maybe I like this, but this other thing is just, you make me sick. I want to spew you out of my mouth. That's a little heavy. That's a little heavy in a rebuke. So that indicates to me that if it's in the Bible, it's going to be a problem. So churches aren't perfect. They all have issues and problems and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And AA is the same thing. I've been back to AA to various meetings, and I leave hungry, because I'm entertained and I'm reminded about the things I need to do to stay sober, but spiritually I'm hungry, because they just aren't, it doesn't do it. So I'm back to a church to get reminded about the spiritual foundations of my sobriety and my spiritual life. So, AA and NA will keep your body sober so you're not dying. The church, if it's good, will keep your spiritual man alive and functional and able to live now and further on. AA just keeps you sober one day at a time for this life. So there's a difference. Anyway, that's my take on church, and I'll make some more comments now, and then I'll try to splice them in. But you got to be conscious of the weaknesses and the strengths. You got to know. I mean, I'll go over the things that are important. You need to be connected with people, and I don't do that very well. I know a lot of people in the church, but I'm not emotionally connected to a lot of people. If I really need to talk to somebody gut level, sometimes I go back to my old AA friends, because they're, you got to parse things with Christians, because you can't talk about some stuff without getting hammered. AA people just listen, and they'll give you their gut level response if they're good friends. They'll sort of ridicule you a little bit, but it's generally, if you've known them for years and you're sober for years, they sort of understand. And that's what I think that my mistake was, that I placated my wife and stayed away from AA. I would have been good if I'd kept my toes in the water there, I think. It would have given me a good counterbalance. On the other hand, if I stayed in AA, I don't know whether I'd still be sober. Spiritually, I was, I went through periods just in the church where I dried up because we got into churches that just weren't doing the job. And I was pretty wacky. So maybe I could have done with a little AA to have people to talk to. But on the other hand, spiritually, I just couldn't have survived on just AA because there was nothing there. I mean, it was loosey goosey. It was like anything goes. It was like that's why I was going to talk about the thing of when I went to first AA, went to AA. I'm always reminded of Star Wars because Star Wars came out early on in my sobriety. I think I was 2-3 years sober when the first one came out. And in the first one, I think, there's the barroom scene, the barroom with all the creatures in it. Well, that's exactly what AA was. It was exactly that way. It was a spiritual, space barroom. All sorts of creatures were there. All sorts of stuff was there. I had my sponsor who was doing tarot cards. I had an awful lot of stuff. People were hyping TM at that thing. A lot of Eastern mysticism. Anything went because AA is sort of like that. They're spiritual, open-minded thing. God in his many forms type of thing. And so you end up with a lot of stuff. And if you're open-minded, well, that's okay. But it's not, the beasties don't always say who they are. They don't come out and say, hi, this is who I am and this is where we're going. They pretty much say whatever works, and then you get whatever they got going. Trust me. I know. My ex-wife wasn't what she said she was. And it took me 6 years to figure out that there was no compromise with what was going on. It was survival. And then, there wasn't a lot of support for that in the church because, once you're married, and that's the way it is. And I understand it biblically why, but, my kids couldn't have survived, and I couldn't have survived, so it is what it is. And I found support to do what I needed to do in AA. I didn't find support in the church, except after I did it. The pastor said, I'm glad we've been worried for 6 months. And I say, well, thanks. But, some people in the church, as it came down, they were really good about it. They were really, 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 really good about it. And they supported me. And they knew and they'd known. And they were there in the really difficult times when I was a single parent, struggling and just flailing around. They were there in big time. I could make a phone call. And made a phone call once. And I was, I was in the first apartment, and it was like, the kids were, my daughter was giving me grief, and she was probably 5. And I was angry, and I lived on a 3rd floor apartment. And I was angry, and she was giving me a hard time. And I stormed up all 3 flights of that thing, carrying her. And I got to the top, got in the thing, and my heart didn't like that at all. It turns out that somewhere in my drinking or whatever, I picked up a thing, and it tended to go into arrhythmia. And, I wasn't really, I really hadn't done anything medically about it. I didn't do anything medically about it until a couple years later, but when it happened, there's not much you can do. All I knew to do was just stop. And I called up the lady in the church, and I said, hey, this is what's going on. She says, we'll be there. And she came and took the kids. And all I knew to do was just to lay down. That's what had worked before. I just laid down. You know, it happened before. You know, it just, as I got older, it got worse and worse and worse. But, you know, it was something I got from drinking, probably. And it just, you know, all I knew was to lay down. And it took a couple hours, but it went into, went into sinus rhythm, and I was okay. But she came right away, got the kids, and I could just sort of tweak out. You know, it was only later that, you know, I spent other times in the hospital at other times. And people were there. These were church people. They weren't AA people, they were church people. And they knew me, and they watched out. You know, I got this problem, and I got to go to, you know, this and that and everything like that, and spend 24 hours in the hospital waiting to convert back to sinus rhythm. But they were there for me, you know, so I can't badmouth church people. They were there for me, you know, in massive ways to this day, you know. I mean, we're just older, but to this day, they're sweet, sweet saints. I've met the sweetest, most wonderful, compassionate people as Christians, you know, and I'm really touched by them. And they pray and they get answers. You know, their prayers and they get answers. I can call and text and they'll pray and things happen. And that's a blessing. You don't get that in AA because I don't think they really know about prayer. They just sort of say, well, I'm thinking about you, I support you, come to a meeting and we'll talk and stuff like that. These Christian people, you know, hey Chuck, I'll pray. And they're able to touch God and you can feel their prayers. You can literally feel their prayers. So the church has been very, very good to me. Very good. The Lord has been very, very good to me. You know, but what I wanted to do was to say, you know, for recovery people at the junction of faith and recovery, you know the land you're walking in. Know the weaknesses and the strengths. You know, understand what you're doing. You know, that's what I want to do, you know. Understand the strengths, be grateful for the strengths, and don't be ashamed to look to the church or something for the strengths that they have, because they have strengths that the recovery groups don't have. And I want you to know that. And I also want the church to know that, hey, you could learn something from these other people. You could learn something. That's it. This is Chuck, Lazarus Recovery YouTube at the junction of faith and recovery. You have a good night. Thank you.